The mahogany-panelled walls of The Gilded Quill did not merely contain sound, they curated it. The clink of silver on porcelain, the murmur of old money discussing new ventures, the sigh of a sommelier uncorking a vintage that cost more than a month's rent. It was a symphony of exclusion, and Ilara Vance, at 22, knew her role was to be an invisible stagehand. Her black uniform was immaculate, her movements economical, her smile a carefully constructed piece of architecture designed to be pleasant but unmemorable. She was a ghost in a palace of appetites. Tonight, however, the symphony had a shrieking, discordant soloist. "Are you deaf or simply incompetent?" Beatrice Sterling's voice, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the hushed ambiance of the private dining room. "I said chilled, not refrigerated. There is a world of difference, a world you clearly know nothing about." Every head in the room, a collection of venture capitalists and tech hopefuls Beatrice was attempting to court, turned. Ilara stood perfectly still, the silver water pitcher in her hand, feeling as heavy as a lead ingot. A single bead of condensation had dripped from it, landing a millimeter from the base of Beatrice's wine glass. It was an insignificant transgression, a tear of cold on a sea of white linen, but Beatrice had reacted as if Ilara had thrown the entire pitcher in her lap. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on a point just over Beatrice's shoulder. "My sincerest apologies, Mrs. Sterling. I will replace it immediately." Her voice was low, steady, a practiced calm she had perfected over 2 years of serving the city's elite to pay down the mountain of medical debt her mother's long illness had left behind. "You'll do more than that," Beatrice sneered, her heavily jeweled hand gesturing dismissively. "You'll learn your place. Some of us are here conducting business that shapes the future. We don't have time for this." She waved a hand that encompassed Ilara's entire being, her simple, neat bun, her clean but unmanicured nails, her worn but polished black shoes. The implication was clear. You are a distraction. You are nothing. The investors shifted uncomfortably. They were here to vet Beatrice's new tech venture, a supposedly revolutionary social platform called Elysian, but they were getting a masterclass in public humiliation instead. Ilara simply inclined her head. "Of course, ma'am." She retreated from the table with a grace that belied the tremor in her hands. As she passed the main dining room, she caught the eye of a man dining alone in a corner booth. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a shock of silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wasn't staring with pity, but with a kind of weary, analytical curiosity, as if he were watching a familiar play unfold and was already bored with the ending. He'd been there for hours, nursing a single glass of whiskey, observing. For a fleeting second, Ilara felt seen, and it was more unsettling than Beatrice's contempt. Back in the humming, stainless steel sanctuary of the kitchen, Ilara took a deep breath. She could feel the familiar burn of frustration behind her eyes, the anger that she had to swallow down like bitter medicine. It wasn't just the insult, it was the injustice of it all. She spent her days serving people who discussed million-dollar valuations, while she spent her nights hunched over a second-hand laptop, teaching herself Python and cryptography, trying to build a future that felt impossibly distant. Her worn leather notebook, tucked into the locker with her coat, was filled not with doodles, but with complex algorithms and cybersecurity protocols. It was her real life, a secret world Beatrice Sterling could never comprehend. She picked up a fresh, perfectly chilled pitcher of water, the linen napkin wrapped around it just so. Before she returned to the lion's den, she paused, pulling out her cheap smartphone. A habit, born of her studies, made her idly scan the restaurant's Wi-Fi network. She'd noticed it weeks ago. A glaring vulnerability. The guest network used an outdated WEP encryption protocol, easily cracked. More than that, it was improperly segmented from the main internal network. A first-year IT student could see the flaw. It was a ticking time bomb in a place that prided itself on discretion and security. She'd even mentioned it to the manager, Monsieur Dubois, a man whose spine seemed to be made of aspic, and he had waved her off. "We have professionals for that, my dear." She shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. The professionals were clearly overpaid and underskilled. She put the phone away and composed her face back into the mask of serene servitude. The performance had to continue. When she re-entered the private room, Beatrice was in the middle of her grand pitch. A large screen had been set up at one end of the room, displaying the sleek, minimalist logo of Elysian. "It's not just a platform, it's a curated reality," Beatrice was saying, her voice oozing with buzzwords. "We leverage synergistic AI and blockchain integration to create a paradigm of bespoke social engagement. It's the future of digital identity." Ilara moved silently around the table, refilling glasses. She listened as Beatrice fielded questions. The investors were sharp, but Beatrice was a master of deflection, using jargon as a smoke screen. Ilara, however, heard the gaps. When one investor asked about data security and encryption standards, Beatrice laughed it off. "Our proprietary system is ironclad. It's so advanced, explaining it would be like trying to describe color to a blind man." Ilara nearly flinched. The phrase was a classic tell, the boast of someone who doesn't know the answer. From her peripheral vision, she saw the old man in the corner booth subtly shake his head, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes before he returned to studying his whiskey. The main course was served and cleared with tense, flawless precision. Ilara functioned on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. She was thinking about the flimsy network, about Beatrice's empty jargon, and about the sheer, galling arrogance of it all. It felt like the entire world was a stage for people like Beatrice, built on foundations as shoddy as the restaurant's Wi-Fi. The final act of cruelty came with dessert. As Ilara placed a delicate chocolate lava cake in front of Beatrice, her hand, still trembling slightly from the earlier encounter, caused the fork to shift and tap against the plate with a soft tink. Beatrice froze. She looked down at the fork, then up at Ilara. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "That's it," she announced to the table, her voice carrying a tone of theatrical finality. "I simply cannot be expected to close a 9-figure deal with this level of incompetence buzzing around me." She looked directly at Ilara, her eyes cold and triumphant. "You are a distraction, an unnecessary variable. Monsieur Dubois." The manager scurried in, his face pale. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling." "This person," Beatrice said, refusing to grant Ilara the dignity of a name, "is fired. I want her out of my sight. Now. Her presence is contaminating the atmosphere." The room fell into a dead silence. The investors stared at their plates. Monsieur Dubois wrung his hands, his gaze darting between the formidable wealth of his client and the stunned, pale face of his employee. "Mrs. Sterling, perhaps," he began weakly. "Perhaps nothing," Beatrice snapped. "Get her out, or you can explain to your owner why my corporate account and the accounts of everyone at this table will be permanently closed by morning." Dubois' shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned to Ilara, his expression a miserable cocktail of apology and cowardice. "Ilara, please, just go. Collect your things." Ilara felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't just the job, the meager paycheck that barely kept the wolves of debt from the door. It was the public stripping of her dignity. She was being erased, dismissed like a piece of trash, all for the crime of existing in the orbit of Beatrice Sterling's ego. She looked at the faces around the table. No one met her eye. They were all complicit in their silence. Then her gaze drifted, almost unconsciously, to the corner booth in the main dining room. The old man was watching, his expression no longer weary, but sharp, intense. He saw it all. Ilara's chin lifted. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would not give Beatrice the satisfaction. She turned to the manager, her voice miraculously steady. "I understand." She turned to leave, but Beatrice wasn't finished. "Wait," she commanded. Ilara paused, her back to the room. "Before you go back to whatever hovel you crawled out of, I want you to watch this. I want you to see what a real future looks like. The kind of future people like you will only ever get to clean up after." She tapped a key on her laptop, and the screen behind her lit up with a live demonstration of the Elysian platform. "Gentlemen," she said to her audience, her voice dripping with pride, "behold the architecture of tomorrow." Ilara stood frozen at the doorway, forced to witness the coronation of the woman who had just destroyed her. A cold, clear anger, purer than any she had ever felt, began to rise within her. It wasn't a hot, messy rage, but a crystalline, focused resolve. Beatrice wanted her to watch. Fine. She would watch. And she would see. The air in the private dining room was thick with the cloying scent of Beatrice's perfume and the metallic tang of humiliation. Ilara stood rooted to the spot, a silent, unwilling spectator at her own execution. Beatrice, basking in the spotlight, began to navigate the Elysian app's interface, which was projected onto the large screen. It was slick, all minimalist aesthetics, and smooth, animated transitions. "As you can see, the user experience is seamless," Beatrice narrated, her voice a purr of self-satisfaction. "Our algorithm curates content based on deep psychometric analysis, ensuring a completely personalized, frictionless reality. It's not just social media, it's a social sanctuary." Ilara's eyes narrowed. It was all surface, no substance. The jargon was a shield, and she knew, with the certainty of a coder who had spent thousands of hours staring at raw logic, that something was profoundly wrong. People who built real things spoke with precision, not platitudes. People who understood security didn't dismiss it. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with lightning speed. The vulnerable Wi-Fi, the empty buzzwords, the desperate need to impress. It was a house of cards, and Beatrice had just handed her a match. Her hand slipped into the pocket of her apron, her fingers closing around her phone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the cold silence of her resolve. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was messy, emotional. This was about truth. It was about order, about the elegant, unyielding logic of code that, unlike people, could not lie. Under the guise of pulling a stray thread from her apron, she angled her phone slightly. A few quick taps. The restaurant's guest Wi-Fi, as she knew, was a wide-open door. Her fingers flew across the small screen, a blur of practiced motion. It took her less than 15 seconds to bypass the flimsy encryption. She was in. From there, finding the IP address of Beatrice's laptop, which was also connected to the guest network for the presentation, was trivial. A simple network scan. There it was. Her thumbs moved with a surgeon's precision, typing commands into a simple terminal emulator app she had built herself. She wasn't launching a brute force attack. She was simply probing, listening. "And now," Beatrice announced, her voice swelling with theatrical importance, "for the centerpiece of our technology, the Elysian Vault. This is where users store their most precious digital assets, memories, documents, cryptocurrency, all protected by our patent-pending quantum-resistant encryption. Ilara almost snorted. Quantum-resistant encryption was the tech equivalent of snake oil, a term used to dazzle the ignorant. As Beatrice navigated to the vault section of the app, Ilara saw her chance. The app would have to send an authentication request to its server. In that brief, fleeting moment of data transfer, she could see its structure. She sent a single, harmless packet of data to the laptop's IP address, a ping essentially, but one designed to elicit a specific response. The response came back, and with it, the address of the server the Elysian app was communicating with. It wasn't some secure, custom-built Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud instance. It was a cheap, shared hosting service, the kind you use for a college blog, not a billion-dollar tech venture. The cold anger in Ilara's chest solidified into an icy certainty. She was right. It was all a sham. "I'll now demonstrate by uploading a secure file," Beatrice said, smiling at her investors. "Let's use our term sheet, shall we? To show you how much faith I have in our own security." She clicked a button on the screen labeled Engage Secure Upload. This was the moment. Ilara knew that a real app would be a compiled, obfuscated piece of software. But a demo, a fake shell designed to look real? It was likely running on a simple, interpreted framework. Maybe even just a web application packaged to look like a desktop client. If so, there might be a backdoor, a debug mode, a developer's shortcut left carelessly open. She didn't try to hack the server. That would be too noisy, too destructive. She targeted the presentation itself. She crafted a simple injection script, not malicious, but disruptive. It was designed to do one thing: find and exploit a cross-site scripting, XSS vulnerability, a common flaw in hastily built web applications. The goal wasn't to steal data, but to make the application reveal its own secrets. She wrapped the script in a packet and sent it directly to the presentation software running on Beatrice's laptop. It was the digital equivalent of whispering a secret command in its ear. She looked up from her phone, her face a perfect mask of blank submission. Her work was done. It had taken less than a minute. On the screen, Beatrice clicked the final confirmation button and uploaded. Perfectly secure, perfectly safe. The future is... Her voice trailed off. The screen flickered. The sleek Elysian interface vanished. In its place, lines of monospaced green text began to cascade down the black screen, like a scene from a 1980s hacker movie. The investors leaned forward, confused. "What's this?" one of them asked. Beatrice stared, her face ashen. It's just a momentary glitch, a system reset." But it wasn't a glitch. Ilara knew exactly what they were seeing. Her script had worked. It had forced the application to dump its developer console log directly to the screen, and the developers, sloppy and confident their work would never be seen, had been brutally honest in their comments. The investors, all tech-savvy to varying degrees, began to read the lines of code aloud, their voices a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "Todo. Build actual encryption. For now, just base 64 encode to look fancy. Warning. This is a hollow shell. All user data is simulated. Do not push to production. Fake blockchain ledger. Generates random hash strings. Looks legit, LOL. Investor demo mode. Active. All metrics are hard-coded. User growth chart is just a static JPEG." The room was utterly silent, save for the quiet, damning scroll of text on the screen. The entire pitch, the revolutionary technology, the 9-figure valuation, it was all there, exposed as a complete and utter fraud, a Potemkin village built of bad code and brazen lies. Beatrice frantically jabbed at her laptop, but the console log kept scrolling, a digital confession that could not be stopped. A small, choked sound escaped her throat. Then, a new voice, calm and resonant, cut through the tension from the corner of the main dining room. "Base 64 encoding," the old man said, rising from his booth and stepping toward the private room's entrance. "I haven't seen anyone try to pass that off as security since 1998. It's the equivalent of writing a password on a sticky note and then turning the note upside down." Pathetic. All eyes turned to him. He walked into the room, his presence filling the space with an effortless authority that made Beatrice's performative power look like a child's tantrum. He glanced at the scrolling code on the screen, a flicker of professional disgust in his eyes. Then his gaze settled on Ilara, who still stood by the door. There was no accusation in his look, only a deep, penetrating understanding. He saw her, not as a waitress, but as the architect of this moment. "This isn't a glitch," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. He addressed the stunned investors, not Beatrice. "This is a confession. The entire platform is a fraud, a shell designed to take your money and disappear. I'd advise you all to call your lawyers. As for you, madam—" He finally turned to Beatrice, his voice dropping to an icy calm. "You have committed wire fraud in my presence. That is unwise." One of the investors, a man named Chen, finally found his voice. "Mr. Pendleton, what are you doing here?" The name dropped into the room like a bomb. Arthur Pendleton, the reclusive, legendary founder of Pendleton Microsystems, the titan of the software industry, a man whose net worth was measured not in billions, but in fractions of a country's GDP. He was the king, and they had all been listening to a jester's pitch. Beatrice Sterling's face, already pale, turned a ghastly shade of white. She looked from the terrifyingly calm face of Arthur Pendleton to the still, silent figure of the waitress she had just fired. And in that moment, the horrifying, impossible truth began to dawn on her. This wasn't a random system failure. This was a targeted, precise, and utterly brilliant act of demolition, and there was only one person in the room who could have done it. Her head swiveled toward Ilara, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. The waitress. The ghost. The incompetent, invisible girl had just single-handedly dismantled her entire empire with a few taps on a cheap smartphone. The silence that followed was a living entity, heavy and suffocating. The scrolling green text on the screen was the only thing that moved, a relentless, digital heartbeat counting down the final seconds of Beatrice Sterling's career. The investors, who moments before had been contemplating nine-figure sums, now looked like men who had narrowly avoided walking off a cliff in the dark. They were staring at Arthur Pendleton, their expressions a mixture of awe and profound relief. His word was gospel in their world. His pronouncement of fraud was a death sentence. Arthur Pendleton ignored them for a moment. His focus was entirely on Ilara. He walked slowly toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away. His eyes, which had seemed weary before, were now alight with a sharp, piercing intelligence. He wasn't looking at her uniform or her tired expression. He was looking at her mind. "That," he said, his voice a low rumble of respect, "was the most elegant piece of ethical sabotage I have ever witnessed. You didn't destroy their server. You didn't steal their data. You simply held up a mirror. You made the system confess its own lies. Brilliant." Ilara felt a hot blush creep up her neck. For the first time all night, she was truly speechless. The most powerful man in technology had just called her brilliant. Beatrice finally found her voice, a strangled, venomous hiss. She hacked me! That's illegal! Arrest her!" She pointed a trembling, diamond-encrusted finger at Ilara. "She's a criminal!" Pendleton turned his head slowly, fixing Beatrice with a look of such profound contempt that she physically recoiled. "Madam, you are standing in the wreckage of a multi-million-dollar fraud you attempted to perpetrate. The young woman by the door merely prevented a crime. She did not commit one. You, on the other hand." He let the sentence hang in the air, its weight promising dire consequences. He then turned to the lead investor, Mr. Chen. "Li, I trust you and your colleagues will preserve all records of this meeting. The SEC will be very interested, as will the district attorney's office." Chen nodded numbly, already pulling out his phone, his face grim. The other investors followed suit, their brief alliance with Beatrice dissolving into a frantic scramble for self-preservation. Beatrice's facade finally crumbled completely. The arrogance, the sneering superiority, it all melted away, revealing the raw, panicked terror beneath. "No. Please, Arthur. Mr. Pendleton. It was just a prototype, a proof of concept. We can fix this." "There is nothing to fix," Pendleton said, his voice utterly final. "You don't build a company on a foundation of lies. You have confused marketing with engineering and ambition with integrity. Your career in this industry is over." He then looked at the quivering manager, Monsieur Dubois. "And you. You stood by and allowed a member of your staff to be publicly humiliated and unjustly fired to placate this fraud. You have a choice. You can call the police to report Mrs. Sterling, or I can have a word with the owner of this establishment. I believe we sit on the museum board together, about the quality of his management." Dubois looked as if he might faint. He fumbled for his phone with shaking hands. I'll call them right now, Mr. Pendleton. Right now." Through it all, Ilara remained silent, watching the chaos she had unleashed. It was like watching a controlled demolition. She hadn't used a bomb. She had simply found the building's fatal structural flaw and given it a precise, calculated push. Pendleton turned back to her, his expression softening. The formidable titan was gone, replaced by the curious old man from the corner booth. "I saw you earlier," he said. "Watching. Thinking. You weren't just serving tables. You were analyzing. I saw your notebook when you came in. It wasn't a server's order pad." Ilara swallowed, finding her voice. "It's just some notes." "I suspect they are more than that," he said. He gestured toward the door, away from the smouldering ruins of Beatrice's life. "Walk with me, young lady. I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss. And first, I owe you a proper dinner. Somewhere the staff is treated with respect." He placed a hand gently on her back, guiding her out of the room. As they stepped into the main dining area, leaving the frantic phone calls and panicked whispers behind, Ilara took one last look back. Beatrice Sterling was slumped in her chair, a pathetic, diminished figure, stripped of her power and prestige. The investors were huddled together, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Monsieur Dubois was stammering into his phone. The symphony of The Gilded Quill was in ruins, and the invisible stagehand was walking out the front door with the king. They didn't go far. Arthur Pendleton led Ilara to a quiet, unassuming bistro a few blocks away, a place with checkered tablecloths and candle wax dripping down the sides of old wine bottles. It was the antithesis of The Gilded Quill. Warm, unpretentious, and real. The owner greeted Arthur by name, seating them at a quiet table in the back without any fuss. For the first few minutes, Ilara could only stare at her hands, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly draining away, leaving a profound, buzzing exhaustion in its wake. She had just upended multiple lives, exposed a major fraud, and been personally escorted from the scene by a living legend. It didn't feel real. Arthur waited patiently, nursing a simple cup of black coffee. He didn't press or interrogate. He simply gave her space to breathe. "They're going to say I'm a hacker," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Beatrice will press charges. I'll lose everything." Arthur took a sip of his coffee. "She will certainly try," he said calmly. "But she will fail. What you did was not hacking in the traditional sense. You did not breach a secure server or steal proprietary information. You exposed a public-facing vulnerability in a fraudulent demonstration. You were, in essence, a whistleblower, a very, very effective one. My legal team," he added with a faint smile, "is quite formidable. They will be at your disposal, though I doubt you will need them." The casual mention of my legal team was a stark reminder of the world she had just stepped into. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him. "Why are you helping me?" Arthur's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful, almost sad expression. "My wife, Eleanor, passed away 5 years ago. She was a brilliant software engineer, far more talented than I ever was. But she was quiet, humble. In the early days, she was constantly overlooked, her ideas stolen by louder, more aggressive men. She had to fight for every scrap of recognition. I see that same fire, that same quiet brilliance in you. And I see the same world trying to snuff it out." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "What I witnessed tonight, that wasn't just a ruse. The silence that followed was a living entity, heavy and suffocating. The scrolling green text on the screen was the only thing that moved, a relentless digital heartbeat, counting down the final seconds of Beatrice Sterling's career. The investors, who moments before had been contemplating 9-figure sums, now looked like men who had narrowly avoided walking off a cliff in the dark. They were staring at Arthur Pendleton, their expressions a mixture of awe and profound relief. His word was gospel in their world. His pronouncement of fraud was a death sentence. Arthur Pendleton ignored them for a moment. His focus was entirely on Elara. He walked slowly toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away. His eyes, which had seemed weary before, were now alight with a sharp, piercing intelligence. He wasn't looking at her uniform or her tired expression. He was looking at her mind. "That," he said, his voice a low rumble of respect, "was the most elegant piece of ethical sabotage I have ever witnessed. You didn't destroy their server. You didn't steal their data. You simply held up a mirror. You made the system confess its own lies." "Brilliant." Elara felt a hot blush creep up her neck. For the first time all night, she was truly speechless. The most powerful man in technology had just called her brilliant. Beatrice finally found her voice, a strangled, venomous hiss. She hacked me! That's illegal! Arrest her!" She pointed a trembling, diamond-encrusted finger at Elara. "She's a criminal." Pendleton turned his head slowly, fixing Beatrice with a look of such profound contempt that she physically recoiled. "Madame, you are standing in the wreckage of a multi-million-dollar fraud you attempted to perpetrate. The young woman by the door merely prevented a crime. She did not commit one. You, on the other hand—" He let the sentence hang in the air, its weight promising dire consequences. He then turned to the lead investor, Mr. Chen. "Lee, I trust you and your colleagues will preserve all records of this meeting. The SEC will be very interested, as will the district attorney's office." Chen nodded numbly, already pulling out his phone, his face grim. The other investors followed suit, their brief alliance with Beatrice dissolving into a frantic scramble for self-preservation. Beatrice's facade finally crumbled completely. The arrogance, the sneering superiority, it all melted away, revealing the raw, panicked terror beneath. "No. Please, Arthur. Mr. Pendleton, it was just a prototype, a proof of concept. We can fix this." "There is nothing to fix," Pendleton said, his voice utterly final. "You don't build a company on a foundation of lies. You have confused marketing with engineering and ambition with integrity. Your career in this industry is over." He then looked at the quivering manager, Monsieur Dubois. "And you? You stood by and allowed a member of your staff to be publicly humiliated and unjustly fired to placate this fraud. You have a choice. You can call the police to report Mrs. Sterling, or I can have a word with the owner of this establishment. I believe we sit on the museum board together, about the quality of his management." Dubois looked as if he might faint. He fumbled for his phone with shaking hands. I'll call them right now, Mr. Pendleton. Right now." Through it all, Elara remained silent, watching the chaos she had unleashed. It was like watching a controlled demolition. She hadn't used a bomb. She had simply found the building's fatal structural flaw and given it a precise, calculated push. Pendleton turned back to her, his expression softening. The formidable titan was gone, replaced by the curious old man from the corner booth. "I saw you earlier," he said. "Watching? Thinking. You weren't just serving tables. You were analyzing. I saw your notebook when you came in. It wasn't a server's order pad." Elara swallowed, finding her voice. "It's just some notes. I suspect they are more than that," he said. He gestured toward the door, away from the smouldering ruins of Beatrice's life. "Walk with me, young lady. I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss. And first, I owe you a proper dinner. Somewhere the staff is treated with respect." He placed a hand gently on her back, guiding her out of the room. As they stepped into the main dining area, leaving the frantic phone calls and panicked whispers behind, Elara took one last look back. Beatrice Sterling was slumped in her chair, a pathetic, diminished figure, stripped of her power and prestige. The investors were huddled together, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Monsieur Dubois was stammering into his phone. The symphony of The Gilded Quill was in ruins, and the invisible stagehand was walking out the front door with the king. They didn't go far. Arthur Pendleton led Elara to a quiet, unassuming bistro a few blocks away, a place with checkered tablecloths and candle wax dripping down the sides of old wine bottles. It was the antithesis of The Gilded Quill, warm, unpretentious, and real. The owner greeted Arthur by name, seating them at a quiet table in the back without any fuss. The air smelled of garlic and bread, not of money and perfume. For the first few minutes, Elara could only stare at her hands, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly draining away, leaving a profound, buzzing exhaustion in its wake. She felt hollowed out, a bell that had been struck too hard. She had just upended multiple lives, exposed a major fraud, and been personally escorted from the scene by a living legend. It didn't feel real. It felt like a line of code that had executed in an unexpected way, sending the entire program into a state she couldn't predict. Arthur waited patiently, nursing a simple glass of red wine. He didn't press or interrogate. He simply gave her space to breathe, to let the echoes of the explosion fade. "They're going to say I'm a hacker," she said finally, her voice thin, fragile. It was the first coherent thought that surfaced from the maelstrom. "Beatrice will press charges. I'll lose everything." "Not that there's much to lose." Arthur took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "She will certainly try," he said calmly. "But she will fail. What you did was not hacking in the traditional sense. You did not breach a secure server or steal proprietary information. You exposed a public-facing vulnerability in a fraudulent demonstration. You were, in essence, a whistleblower, a very, very effective one. My legal team," he added with a faint smile, "is quite formidable. They will be at your disposal, though I doubt you will need them. Consider them a firewall." The casual mention of my legal team was a stark reminder of the world she had just stepped into, a world where problems like this could be handled. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him, the question raw and necessary. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." Arthur's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful, almost sad expression. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the crimson liquid cling to the sides. "My wife, Eleanor, passed away 5 years ago. She was a brilliant software engineer, far more talented than I ever was. But she was quiet, humble. In the early days, she was constantly overlooked, her ideas stolen by louder, more aggressive men. She had to fight for every scrap of recognition. She used to say that the world was full of people who confused volume with value." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "What I witnessed tonight, that wasn't just a rude customer. It was a sickness, an arrogance that believes wealth confers superiority, that service staff are furniture, that integrity is a currency to be spent. It's the victory of volume over value. I have spent the last few years becoming cynical, watching people like Beatrice Sterling rise on tides of jargon and confidence. Tonight, you reminded me that competence and character still exist, the quiet ones, the ones who actually build things. You didn't just expose a fraud, you restored a little bit of my faith in the architecture of things." He asked her about her life, and for the first time, Elara told her story to someone who truly listened, not with pity, but with the focused attention of an engineer examining a schematic. She spoke of her mother, a librarian who taught her to love the logic and beauty of systems, from the Dewey Decimal System to the elegant structure of a sonnet. She spoke of the cancer, the years of watching her mother fade, and the crushing weight of the bills that remained, a debt that felt like a living thing, a constant, silent pressure at the base of her skull. She spoke of her nights spent learning to code, not for a degree or a job, but because it was a sanctuary. In the world of code, the rules were fair. Logic was king. A good argument, a clean line of code, always won, regardless of who wrote it. It was a meritocracy of the mind. She pulled out her worn leather notebook and slid it across the table. Arthur opened it with the reverence of a scholar handling a rare manuscript. He didn't just glance. He read, his finger tracing a particularly complex algorithm she had designed for network analysis, her own handwritten comments in the margins. "This is not student work," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "This is poetry. The structure, the efficiency. It's the work of a natural, an artist. To do this, self-taught, while carrying the weight you've been carrying. Elara, do you have any idea how remarkable you are?" Elara just shook her head, a single hot tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. She wasn't sad. It was the tear of a dam breaking, of years of pent-up exhaustion and loneliness finally finding a release. Their conversation shifted. It was no longer an interview, but a collaboration. They talked about cryptography, about the ethics of artificial intelligence, about the subtle tyranny of predictive algorithms. For 2 hours, she wasn't a waitress. She was a peer, her ideas met with respect and sharp, insightful questions. She felt a part of her mind, long dormant and starved, finally stretching and coming to life. As the evening wound down, Arthur set his glass down and looked at her directly. "I am not going to simply offer you a job, Elara. That would be an insult to your talent, and frankly, a waste of it inside a corporate structure. I want to make you a proposition." He explained his plan. He was funding a new, independent cybersecurity initiative through his philanthropic foundation. It wouldn't be a corporate entity chasing profits, but a watchdog group, an ethical hacking consortium dedicated to exposing fraud and security vulnerabilities in the systems we are all forced to trust. The very thing she had done tonight, but on a global scale. "I don't want to hire you as an employee," he said, his voice precise. "I want you to help me build it. I want you to lead its technical division. I will provide the funding, the resources, the legal cover, the entire scaffolding. You will provide the vision and the talent. You will be the architect." Elara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the scale of what he was offering. It wasn't just a lifeline, it was a kingdom. The thought was so vast it was terrifying. The ghost of the waitress inside her screamed that she was an imposter, that she would fail. "And your mother's debt," he added gently, seeing the conflict warring in her eyes. "Consider it a signing bonus. We'll have it cleared by the end of the week. No one can build a new world while chained to the old one." The tears came freely then. Not tears of humiliation or anger, but of profound, shattering gratitude. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Arthur said with a kind smile, "and in the meantime, get some rest. Your life is about to change." He arranged for a car to take her home. As she rode through the glittering streets of Manhattan, Elara looked out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. She was no longer a ghost moving through this world. She was being asked to become one of its architects. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt the unshakable certainty that she was going to win. The days that followed were a whirlwind of managed deconstruction and careful rebuilding. The news of the Elysian debacle didn't explode in a public scandal. Arthur Pendleton was too discreet for that. Instead, it imploded. Quiet phone calls were made. The venture capital firms that had been courting Beatrice withdrew their interest, citing due diligence failures. An anonymous tip, detailed and irrefutable, was sent to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the New York Attorney General's office. Beatrice Sterling's name was suddenly radioactive. Her assets were frozen pending investigation. The world she had built on bravado and deceit dissolved not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of a lawyer's briefcase. Monsieur Dubois was, as promised, dismissed from the Gilded Quill. The restaurant's ownership, after a brief but pointed conversation with Arthur Pendleton, issued a formal, private apology to Elara, along with a settlement that was, by itself, life-changing. They also overhauled their entire digital security infrastructure based on an anonymous memo detailing its vulnerabilities. 3 days after her dinner with Arthur, Elara logged into her bank portal to make another painful, meager payment on her mother's medical debt. It was a ritual of grief and obligation. But the balance was simply gone. A single line item read, "Account paid in full." She stared at the screen for a full 10 minutes, the silence in her small apartment filled with the absence of a weight she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. A debt with its own gravitational pull, it had warped her life around it. And now it was gone. She closed the laptop, walked to the window, and wept, not for the past, but for the sudden, terrifying expanse of the future. Arthur's promise was not about a simple rescue. It was about empowerment. He connected her with a small, fiercely loyal team from his foundation, a seasoned project manager named Maria, a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a kind heart, a grizzled but brilliant systems architect named Ben, who communicated better in Python than in English, and a sharp, ethical lawyer named David, who saw the law as another kind of code to be interpreted. They weren't yes-men. They were collaborators, tasked with helping Ilara build her vision. Their first office was a quiet, sunlit wing of the New York Public Library's main branch, surrounded by the hushed reverence of knowledge. Arthur insisted on it. "Start here," he'd told her. "Remember that what you're building is about protecting information, not just hoarding it." The challenges were immediate and immense. Ilara, used to being invisible, now had to lead. She had to articulate her strategies, defend her choices, and manage the personalities of her new team. In their first strategy meeting, she found herself fumbling for words, her ideas clear in her head, but clumsy on her tongue. The ghost of Beatrice Sterling's voice echoed in the cavernous reading room, calling her incompetent, a distraction. She could feel the weight of their expectations, of Arthur's faith in her, and she felt herself shrinking. After one particularly halting presentation, Maria found her staring blankly at a whiteboard, covered in her own elegant but chaotic diagrams. "Imposter syndrome is just a sign that you're pushing your own boundaries," Maria said gently, placing a cup of tea on the table beside her. "The day you stop feeling it is the day you stop growing. You see the entire architecture in your head, Ilara. We just need you to draw us the blueprint, one room at a time. Now, walk me through this encryption analysis again. You lost me at the Diffie-Hellman key exchange." Slowly, methodically, with Maria's guidance, they began to build. They named the initiative Project Cassandra, after the mythological prophetess who spoke the truth but was never believed. Their mission was to find the fatal flaws in the systems everyone else trusted, to be the voice of warning before the citadel fell. Their first target was a popular financial services app that claimed to offer military-grade security. Ilara, working with Ben, spent a week submerged in its code. They discovered a flaw, not as simple as the one at the restaurant, but just as devastating, a vulnerability in their two-factor authentication reset process that would allow a skilled attacker to hijack an account with just a phone number and a clever piece of social engineering. They didn't leak the story to the press. That wasn't their way. Following the protocol they had established, David, the lawyer, drafted a formal, confidential disclosure. Ilara, as the head of the project, requested a meeting with the company's CEO and board. The meeting was tense. The boardroom was a sterile expanse of glass and steel, a place designed to intimidate. The company's engineers were defensive, their executives dismissive. They looked at this young woman in a simple blazer with no fancy degrees or corporate pedigree, and saw a nuisance, a potential shakedown. But Ilara was no longer the silent waitress. She was calm, precise, and unshakable. She stood at the head of the table, her laptop connected to their projector, and she began to speak. She didn't make accusations, she presented data. She walked them through the exploit, step by logical step, her voice steady and clear. The logic was her armor. When the company's head of engineering tried to dismiss her findings as a theoretical edge case, Ilara simply nodded to Ben, who, with her permission, ran a live, harmless demonstration on a closed network, proving the vulnerability in real time by taking over a dummy account. The boardroom fell silent, the atmosphere chillingly similar to the one at Fekhadir's the Gilded Quill. It was the silence of arrogance, colliding with irrefutable fact. The company, faced with proof, had no choice but to act. They fixed the flaw, averting a potential disaster that could have affected millions of users. They also, at Arthur's quiet insistence, made a substantial donation to Project Cassandra's funding. It was a quiet victory, celebrated not with champagne, but with pizza and a sense of profound satisfaction in their library workspace. Elara had not only proven her skill, but had also found her voice, a voice of quiet authority, built not on volume, but on value. Months later, Elara found herself standing outside the Gilded Quill. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the warm light from the restaurant spilled onto the sidewalk. She wasn't there for dinner. She was just looking. The place seemed smaller now, less intimidating. It was just a building. Its power had been an illusion she had once believed in, a stage for a play she was no longer a part of. Her phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from Arthur. Your work was mentioned in a closed session of a congressional subcommittee on cybersecurity today. They didn't use your name, of course. They just referred to a new, powerful, non-state actor for accountability in the tech sector. Thought you should know. Well done. Elara smiled, a real, unburdened smile. She didn't need the public recognition. She didn't need her name in the headlines. She had something far more valuable. She had her work. She had her team. She had her purpose. She was about to turn away when her phone buzzed again. A second message from Arthur. It was a single file attachment, heavily encrypted. The subject line read, "Your next challenge, if you choose to accept." Curious, she ducked into the alcove of a nearby bookstore and, using a custom decryption app on her phone, opened the file. It wasn't a corporate target. It was a single, complex string of code, a piece of a larger program. There were no notes, no explanation, just the code itself, and a single question from Arthur beneath it. What is this? She scanned the lines, her mind immediately recognizing the patterns, the syntax, the underlying philosophy. It was elegant, powerful, and deeply unsettling. It wasn't commercial code. It was a surveillance protocol, not designed to steal money or data, but to monitor, to track, to listen. The architecture was sophisticated, state-sponsored level, and deep within its core, buried under layers of obfuscation, she found it. A flaw. Not a mistake, but a deliberate backdoor, a master key, a single point of failure that would allow whoever knew about it to control the entire surveillance network, to turn it from a tool of observation into a weapon of control. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't about exposing a fraudulent startup or a careless bank. This was an entirely different league. This was the architecture of power itself. Exposing this wouldn't result in a quiet settlement and a donation. It would attract the attention of people who did not operate in boardrooms. She looked up from her phone, the glittering lights of the city suddenly seeming sinister, like the nodes of a vast, invisible network. She thought of Beatrice Sterling, a petty tyrant in a gilded cage. Then she thought of this code, a silent, global panopticon. She had vanquished a monster only to be shown the dragon. This was the real test, not of her skill, but of her courage. Arthur hadn't just given her a kingdom, he had shown her the true nature of the war. She pulled the collar of her coat tighter and began to type her reply, her fingers moving with cold, clear certainty. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. She was a ghost in the machine, and she was about to make it confess.